Cool. Excited to be here with everybody. So it's been awesome to see the growth of funding the commons over the years. We started roughly around, I think 3 years ago-ish, 2021 or so. And in that time span, we've seen truly incredible growth in the number of applications of different kinds of funding mechanisms to govern all kinds of different sorts of commons. The set of people joining the community and building things now is super large. We've seen just this steady growth and compounding year over year. I think we're into the several thousand people in the commons community that are actively building or working on some concrete set of mechanisms, and that's been really, really great. So what I want to do today is, I tend to do this every year for the funding in the commons community, is talk a little bit about how the world is changing right now and look ahead while there's some time into how the next year is going to operate and give some set of priorities for how you can apply your energy and your work to try to maximize results with a look ahead into what's going to matter the years in the future. Meaning, what I want to distill here for you is a set of a small number of priorities, and these will matter a lot in the long term, in the, say, five-year time scale. And normally, if you've seen my talks in the past, I usually have like a lot of different slides and whatnot. Bad news, my own laptop broke 2 days ago, so I don't have access to all my keynote files. So I have a distillation of the points and earlier versions, and so I'll do it more interactive and hop around between things. For the people who have seen me do that, that's also really good, but it doesn't mean that I have a perfect flow, so we'll be hopping around a little bit. So let's go through the set of priorities. Before I go into this, let's set the stage a little bit. Over the last few years, we've seen tremendous growth in the crypto community. I'll show you a graph later. Both the level of capital that the community harnesses is now in the 2-point-something trillion scale. And there are tens of thousands of people actively building and millions of people actively using crypto around the world, including for payments, for holding currency and whatnot. So the stage is set extremely well for better mechanisms to govern commons at large. But we're missing good products that enable those people to use these new ways of operating. On the flip side, there are major economic shifts that are brewing due to AI. Everyone here has seen it, has heard it. It feels like a tired conversation. But I just want to be hyper clear, and here actually I will rely on some slides from something else. Yeah, I'll skip those. I was gonna just try to use some graphs to make the point. Is it needed? Yeah, should I? I'll do it because it's kind of like a useful thing. You've heard the conversation, and it's getting tired around just how much AI is going to change everything. But I want to be super crisp and clear that the world is currently not ready for the level of economic shifts that are going to happen due to the models that are being built right now and the next generations coming in the next 2, 4, 6, 15 years. And so the scalability here is really good. We have not found a breaking point in the scaling of the intelligence of the models, which means that we're going to start injecting better and higher level intelligence into every factor of the economy at large. Today, you're seeing massive scale call centers shut down and increase their UX. So users of call centers are seeing record high numbers in terms of customer satisfaction, at the same time as you're seeing massive layoffs in terms of all of these call centers being replaced with AI models. That's just one example. Law firms are going to go through similar types of things. As these models get better, you'll see that happening in more and more and more sectors of the economy. To complicate matters, we're starting to build, we're finally to the point where software is catching up to the hardware and finally able to do much more sophisticated robotics, which means that by 2030, 2035, we're going to be able to rely on fleets of robots to do large-scale manual work. These two things together will dramatically shift the production scale of Earth, will totally change how humans build things and scale things. This is happening quickly, and it'll follow the typical adoption curve where nobody believes it, then suddenly it starts happening, and then everyone feels like this is obvious. And that transition will be a 2 to 5 year time span. So knowing that this is going to happen, or that this is high likelihood of happening, of course, the future is unpredictable by nature. A lot of things could occur. Some of these things may not come to pass for lots of reasons, but it's a very high probability set of outcomes. So that means that the world truly needs to change the structure of our economics. We need some other way for humans to have control and direction over how the economy functions, which makes our work in this community dramatically more important. Because the mechanisms that we're building are mechanisms to govern how we route resources, how we allocate work, how we allocate ourselves, how we orient our thought. And so our mechanisms are ways of distilling opinion from many different participants into concrete and actionable things that some process should take. And so our work, if we do it right over the next 2 to 5 years, can shape the future of the global economy. And the crypto community is the best testing ground for us to do that. Meaning the mechanisms that we build, if we can get them working at the trillion scale, 1 to 10 trillion scale, that is large enough that we can truly test these things to work for operating city scale things, but small enough that we can experiment a lot and move very quickly. You can't experiment at the multi-trillion scale that easily, or like at the 10, 20 trillion scale that easily. Governments are super risk averse. So we can experiment, we can run the experimental lab process for the world, figure out better economic flows, figure out the solution, and shape the outcome for the rest of the world. So we can think about how the future might unfold, think of a set of plausible scenarios, find a preferable outcome, do the work to figure out how to get there, and orient the rest of the world to upgrade smoothly into this. Lots of technologies in the past have developed this way. The internet that you benefit from today was shaped this way over decades of people working hard, looking ahead, and building the infrastructure for us. So I say that to describe why what we're doing is critical. Now, I want to distill out the things that I think are important in 2025. So we will see huge capital increases. So just to put into perspective, this is the current scale of capital that treasuries around in the Ethereum ecosystem have, and that's the crypto market cap. So 2.6 trillion and growing. So you should expect in 2025, it is very likely, unclear, but it's very likely that the crypto industry will continue growing quite a bit. And so these treasuries may keep their current value, or only decrease a little bit, or possibly 2 to 5x. Which means that in that time frame, these resources can then be used much more scalably. So if we can orient, and by the way, all of these groups, especially the DAOs, have no good ways of allocating the resources. Everyone is struggling with how do you govern these large-scale common resources and allocate them to people. It's precisely what our community is for. So if we build good mechanisms and scale them, then we can get an upgrade between all of these, which will then upgrade the entire crypto community. And if we're allocating single trillions well, and those scale, it'll give us the confidence to be able to reach out to governments at large and shift how tens of trillions get allocated. So that's the global priority of this community. Now, practically, for the next year, where I think we need to be, so I'm going to give a set of 3 ideas for concrete FTC builders individually, and 3 ideas for the community at large. So for individual builders, I think people really need to focus on solving medium-sized problems. So not small problems that a small community has, or big problems like how to totally change the flow of capital in like entire governments, because those are too hard and too slow. And so medium-sized problems give you the aperture of something sizable enough where the thing can be scaled to have high impact, but small enough that your experimentation can move very quickly. And so I would point you towards these kinds of things. And I underscored the word solve, because I've seen, when we started the Funding the Commons community, there was the promise of this possibility, but no ideas, or very few ideas. And so we needed to stimulate a group and bring together a lot of minds to generate a lot of ideas. And we've done that over the last 2 to 3 years. We've generated an enormously valuable set of ideas. We've also translated a number of those ideas into active projects that people are taking on. There are many projects out there over the last 2 to 3 years, that have put into practice a bunch of those mechanisms and are starting to scale them into the tens of millions. But overall, my sense is that we have a glut of ideas, meaning we have an oversupply of ideas today, and way less execution that's focused to actually solve problems. And so I would orient each and every one of you much more actively towards solving concrete and tractable problems in the next 2 to 3 years for people. And when you do this, try to distill those mechanisms into composable structures that could be copy-pasted into other environments and scaled. Also factor in that when you solve this problem, by the nature of what we're building, it tends to not be a straightforward monetizable product. So the VC industry doesn't know how to deal with us. And that means that the entire capital funnel that the world relies on to do innovation isn't easily accessible to us. It is hard for our community to raise money from VC, which means that we need to do two things. One, tune some of those products so they're VC compatible, or two, convince the treasuries to fund it at VC scale. To be clear, VC scale is tens to hundreds of millions per year. That's what it takes to build software. We can benefit from AI decreasing the costs, but up to a point. So either build something that is VC compatible, or build something where you manage to convince people to give you tens of millions of dollars. So suggestion 2 is to work hard to put in place now, to bake into systems, a routing of at least 10%. Many of you and I would agree that it should be a much higher number, but at least 10% of crypto network supply to public goods funding structures. I'll give you a mechanism for how to do this. But if we can bake in this rule in now and make it a norm across the industry while things are still small, especially where things are in an upswing in a bull market, then as networks get much bigger, this 10% is going to add up to an enormous amount of capital that will be able to transform tons of things. So work really hard now to bake this in as a norm industry-wide across ecosystems. This is one of my strongest recommendations to most founders that I talk to when they build crypto networks today. I'm actively working on multiple networks that I work on to go in this direction, but just strongly recommend route as much, at least 10%, if not more, of the network supply to public goods broadly defined. You want that definition to be a focused aperture where the network should be funding with a priority towards things that are good for it, meaning you need to build and fund the goods that are good for that network. But it should be so broadly defined that as those networks succeed, the aperture widens, and then you have the spillover effect to fund more and more things. Dependencies, further and further away dependencies. So very concretely, for the Falcon network, for the Ethereum network, this would mean initially funding our own implementation teams, and as we succeed, then funding our dependency software, the dependency science, the dependency communities, and then wider and wider use cases, to the point where if we scale to networks that are worth tens to hundreds of trillions, which is very possible in a 20 to 50 year time scale, then those things can actually fund at the level of nation states. That's one of the things that I find most exciting about this industry. These networks can scale to be capital allocators at the scale of nation states. The world's total budget of R&D it's on the order of 200 to 400 billion a year. The US is about 90 billion a year. That's total. So crypto networks can do that. The third thing that I would strongly recommend individuals to do is that right now AI systems are pretty dumb still, which means that they don't work really well for all the things, but you can start leveraging AI systems to make your own work faster and more efficient. You can drop costs all over the place. But more importantly, you can start expecting that as those models get smarter, they'll be able to do more things. So start reconfiguring your structure, start reconfiguring your organizations and your systems and protocols to be able to plug in models that are smarter as they emerge. They don't have to be smart enough right now. They just have to be like good enough where you can design a structure where you can assume that as things get smarter, you can swap things in place. So now, some thoughts for the broad community. I think the number one thing that the community needs to do is to increase experimentation through the solving medium-sized problems piece. So it's not just like increasing experimentation in the more hackathons and so on, though I think we need to do that. It's getting the experimentation all the way into solving medium-sized problems. So a lot of us need to be focused on how do we support a lot of people in doing that work, in taking ideas that we have already come up with over the last 2 to 3 years and putting them into practice and solving problems and getting to the point where they're having large-scale impact. The second thing we need to do is we need to help find cash flows to connect to these builders. It's not one piece of that is helping get them funded initially, but much more important than that is help them find a cash flow that is going to grow with their success so that they can fund all of the development in an ongoing basis. So that means better business model development, setting good norms around the community that PGF mechanisms need to earn a fraction of the money they allocate so that you can build the mechanism in a better way. Suggest other more creative, more interesting, more crypto-native ways of generating fee structures. Think about the sequencer fees that now are powering all of Optimism and therefore all of RetroPGF and therefore a lot of PGF communities. We can probably come up with similar kinds of innovative business models like this. And so find good cash flows and hook them into PGF streams. And crucially, PGF streams that end up producing some fee tax that goes to the build out of the PGF mechanisms themselves. A lot of this community, because this community is so kind and generous, tends to undervalue its own contribution and underappreciate how expensive it is to build things. And therefore, lots of builders don't go in the route of like building nonprofits instead of startups or not paying themselves very much and so on, which ends up doing is it creates an environment where it does not give you the ability to get capital at the tens of millions of dollars scale, which means that you cannot hire large enough teams to actually build your thing, and therefore you end up not being as successful. So it is totally fine to take a portion of the cash flow and value that you're generating to feed back into the build out of the thing itself. And so we as a community need to normalize this and make it much more easy for a lot of builders to do this. And the third thing that I think we can do, and this doesn't need that many of us, we need to set up a good builder funnel. A number of us have done this over the last few years for many networks, of going from early media to learning about how to develop this, to experimentation with hackathons, to building a thing, to scaling it, to finding a business model and growing. And currently we don't have one for the funding the commons and for the PGF community, and I think we need to build one. Yeah. So, yeah. Sorry, I'm like more serious in the talk than I meant to be, mostly because like I started it kind of heavy and like the stuff is really freaking terrifying about the future, and so it kind of like colors my perspective a bit. But to end on a good note, maybe the last thing I'll mention is last couple of years I've been pushing a lot this notion of funding networks, and finally a lot of this thinking has percolated through a lot of people, and a number of us have been ideating around this, and I think now we're starting to see this emerge a lot more. So again, think of your mechanisms as composable units and think about how to weave them together into larger and larger networks. So you can use your structure as a single unit router that can then do something simple that can then be composed. A huge plug here for the Allo protocol and for all the stuff that Gitcoin and Kevin Owaki and others are building, because that's like the right direction for this kind of thing. Plug for the RetroPGF communities that are starting to do downstream RetroPGF program funding, like OP RetroPGF funding, Lip2P, and so on. And so keep building that network structure, and I think we can be in a pretty good place. So anyway, I'll end with showing this slide again. Solve medium-sized problems, route more than 10% of the crypto network supply to PGF, reconfigure for and leverage AI in all things, and then increase experimentation, find cash flows, and let's set up a good builder funnel. So cool. Hope to see you next year. Thanks. Sure. Yeah, I can take questions. Maybe one plug while people are thinking of questions is the pop-up cities movement and the network states movement is a great place to experiment with a lot of fun mechanisms. So consider coming out to some of the pop-up cities and just trying out new things there. It's also a great way to build things. Cool. I think I saw, yeah.
So you have a problem, right? Let's say like milestones. So for talking about like solving problems, let's say we have like certain milestones, right? What's the mechanism for like verifying that certain milestones are actually achieved in the solving of a problem?
I mean, that's very problem dependent. And what I would say is usually you're solving a problem for someone or a group. And they are the arbiters of whether or not you've solved that problem. And so that becomes a structure where you have to define the measures and the objectives in a concrete way. Usually the reason the world is primarily a capitalist structure now is that usually the way you do that is that people are either willing or not to pay you. And that's usually a really good measure, right? Like if they're going to pay you for doing this job, it's going to work. If not, you have your answer. It's not working.
What do you see the main challenges in creating this builder funnel at large scale? Especially in crypto community.
So you mean like the builder funnel type thing?
Yeah, so we need to bring the capital and we need to find a way to funnel that into PGF. So what do you think are like main challenges that we need to overcome for this to exist?
So builder funnel is not necessarily, think about a structure like this where it's not a single program. Think of like many programs that create a ladder that over time, people participate, learn about things, and then they may experiment with hackathons or other things, and then you create a structure to help support them to get into like actually refining a product and then eventually get accelerators or whatever. This pathway is startup oriented, so accelerators and investment makes sense for that. PGF needs an equivalent. I think it would be great to have like the equivalent of a VC fund that invests in PGF. But in order to make that work, we do need to have an actual cash flow return coming from the PGF mechanisms back into those funds. So creating a structure that actually does that, I think could be an unlock. Cool.
All right, any other questions? One more, last one. Connor.
Why does it need to be on the 10 million to $1 billion scale as a problem? And
because
what's it about that as a sweet spot?
If you are solving a problem at a smaller scale, usually it's hard to find that same exact problem in a bunch of other places, and it's just not going to have that much impact in the medium term. And if it's bigger than that scale, like I see a lot of people in the Funding the Commons community, which like are very strongly oriented towards solving massive scale, boil the ocean level problems. I am a professional ocean boiler, and I love that. But the way you do that is by staggering your approach and boiling smaller amounts of water first. And so if you try to go and if you say, okay, we need to change the entire world, then you're like, oh, I have to go convince governments and the UN and so on. And look where that is, right? Like the US is probably about to pull out of the Kyoto Protocol again. And that doesn't really work today. Yeah. And so on the flip side, the things that have worked in the last 20, 30 years are techno-capital style, massive scalable structures. And I think today, if we solve this kind of scale of problem, we can show that it works for the crypto community and then scale it out to the world.
And for a lot of projects in here who are working on what are really public goods kinds of problems, how do you size the problem? Because obviously like $1 billion is easy to answer when it's a revenue stream. It's a little bit harder to say this is a $1 billion problem when you're
I would concretely frame it as there is a revenue stream involved. So there's an amount of capital that you're going to allocate, and there's a percentage that you're able to extract from that capital flow as a fee for providing higher quality decision making. And that percentage is your size of problem, right? So if you create a mechanism that a community that's allocating $100 billion or $10 billion worth of funding, and you're able to extract like a 3% fee or like a 1% fee out of that for providing dramatically better decisions, that gives you a pretty sizable revenue stream that you can use. Now, maybe that's too large, maybe that's not going to happen. Maybe these communities, I think like the EF report said 100-ish million a year. So you might be able to get like 500K to $1 million or something like that if you truly demonstrate that this is dramatically better than some other approach. you have to give people a cost reduction, right? Like you can't sell this kind of mechanism unless you are actually giving a cost reduction. And it becomes really easy to sell that. You just say, hey, you're currently spending X. How about you spend less than that and produce better decisions? But you have to give me some amount because I have to pay people in order to build the damn thing. So I just, the whole you have to pay people to build the thing is a meme that like we need to learn more. Cool. All right, let's end here. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.